All right, so my name is Christopher Brown, and without further ado, let's get into the fate of lactate. So first thing to discuss is that this lactate that we're talking about is the byproduct of glycolysis, right? So glycolysis we talked about in the last lecture. It takes place in the mitochondria, produces a bunch of ATP down the line, all that good stuff. So this lactate is sent through the blood to the liver. Other times it's sent to other other cells and surrounding muscles, but mainly takes place in the liver, so that's what we're going to discuss it taking place. Lactate is sent through the blood to the liver, where it undergoes gluconeogenesis, glucose meaning gluco relating to glucose, neo meaning new, genesis meaning the creation of, literally the new creation of glucose from this lactate in the liver is sent back through, and then that glucose is sent back through the blood to skeletal muscles where it's used for glycolysis again. So you end up with this cycle that can be repeated over and over and over and over to continually yield ATP so you can continue to exercise, right? But we'll get into why it's not technically an endless cycle, right? As anybody who's exercised knows, you can't just keep exercising forever. I mean, maybe at super low intensities, you can go for a very long time, but you definitely can't jog or run at higher speeds for super long periods of time. Eventually you get tired, right? You run out of energy. We'll get into that. Cool. So on to the next slide. So we'll start to understand some of the reasons why it's not an endless cycle by checking this out. So as you start to increase your total endurance through endurance training, you start to increase the number and size of mitochondria in the blood, in your cells, right? So as your body has more mitochondria, you can go through the process of glycolysis not only more effectively, but quicker, right? So you're starting to create more ATP more quickly. So that's being more readily available to be used. And then also, on the other side, the turnover rate for lactate, gluconeogenesis, which takes place in the liver, starts to streamline itself. It goes on more quickly and also more effectively, right? So you're creating more glucose quickly through gluconeogenesis, and you're utilizing that glucose more effectively and faster, right? And ultimately, those are paired with the idea of you having a higher blood lactate threshold. So what is a blood lactate threshold? So this is the negative. This is why the Cori cycle is an endless source of energy. As you start to produce more and more lactate from exercising, right? The rate at which that lactate gets gets used for gluconeogenesis gets surpassed by the rate at which that lactate is being produced, right? So if you're not producing more glucose, so if you're not producing more energy than lactate you're using, trying to simply put that, you end up with this lactate buildup, right? So you end up with more lactate in the bloodstream than you're supposed to have, I guess to say, or you start to end up with more than your body can prepare for, more than you can actually utilize. So you end up with this buildup of lactate in the bloodstream, which negatively affects your ability to exercise at high intensities and for longer periods of time. And that's something that can be kind of prevented with training, right? So the more that you train, the more endurance you start to build up, the better your body becomes at these processes, the higher blood lactate threshold you end up with. So if you check out this graph, you can see that the trained example here is able to perform not only the same work rate with less blood lactate, but also goes on to perform a higher work rate total, right? So he's able to perform more work on top of producing less lactate from lower work. So double positive from that. All right, so we'll take this moment to address this kind of like common misconception. Lactate and lactic acid are not the same thing. Oh, my coaches always told me lactic acid. Yes, but no. So lactic acid and lactate are similar, very similar, except for a hydrogen, right? So lactic acid contains that hydrogen, right? If you guys know anything about chemistry, if you've taken chemistry in the past, you start to understand that hydrogen is the root of a lot of these acids, right? So lactic acid contains a hydrogen that lactate does not. So if you see in this diagram, literally lactic acid only has one extra hydrogen that lactate does. But in our text, they get into the idea that lactate also picks up a positively charged sodium or potassium ion And that's where that lactate kind of forms while it's missing that hydrogen. But yes, so they're not the same thing. They should not be used interchangeably, whether your coach or your internet tells you so, but they are not the same thing. All right, so firstly, the first condition you have to meet, you absolutely have to have lactate, right? So in order to create lactate, glycolysis has to be going on, and that's going to occur at a much higher level as you increase the intensity of your activity, right? So the more intense that you're exercising, the more lactate is being produced, the more lactate your body can use, right? But you can't continue to build up that lactate without giving your body a chance to clear it out and utilize gluconeogenesis, right? So short breaks have to take place as well. Because it's an aerobic process, aerobic literally meaning it uses oxygen, you have to be in a state where you're consuming a lot of oxygen and it's not just immediately being used up for a different process in order for gluconeogenesis to occur, right? So this is mostly going to take place when you have some short breaks in between high intensity sessions. So high intensity interval training is going to be a great source of utilizing this gluconeogenesis because there are those breaks in between. And lastly, we get into the idea of lactic acidosis. So it's kind of a scary term if you look at acidosis, whatever. But so literally all it means is that your lactate production is so far surpassing your body's ability to clear out that lactate that's starting to negatively affect you, right? So your body literally has more of those hydrogens. So those hydrogens that are breaking off from that lactic acid, the more of those you have in your bloodstream, the less your body can kind of like buffer for, right? So buffer meaning that's what it's using a buffer to kind of protect itself from the effects of those hydrogen, right? The less buffers that you have, as you start to run out of buffers because you have so much hydrogen, you run into lactic acidosis, right? Which is literally the accumulation of hydrogen atoms from lactic acid, and it disturbs homeostasis. So homeostasis is what your body always strives to be in, right? When it's cold, your body starts to warm itself up. When it's warm, your body will cool itself down. But the whole idea is this hydrogen is building up so much, your blood pH is starting to lower. And as it becomes more acidic, your body just kind of has no way out at this point, right? You can't continue to exercise and produce lactate because your body can't clear it out. So all in all, if you work out super high intensity for long periods of time, start to end up with lactic acidosis. A lot of you guys will start to feel the effects of it at the end of your workout. You just feel really hot and tired. Maybe you trained one body part. This is the biggest thing for me. You train one body part, but then you don't want to work another, if that makes sense. So like, let's say you train upper body really heavy. Then you start, I'm going to go squat after this, but you start to squat and you're like, wait, I feel really tired, but I didn't use my legs doing anything. Because that lactic acid is still in your bloodstream and it starts to affect the entirety of your body, right? So yeah, that's the end of that. Got my references here for you guys. But yeah, that's it.